To the human eye, the limestone facade of the Biltmore Estate does not look like a house. It looks like a government. Stretching 375 feet from end to end, the structure dominates the horizon of the Blue Ridge Mountains with the kind of authority usually reserved for cathedrals or capitals. It is not merely large. It is a mathematical anomaly in the history of American residential architecture. The footprint of the foundation alone covers 4 acres of North Carolina soil. When you approach the front lawn, you are looking at 178,926 square feet of enclosed space. This number is difficult to contextualize, so consider this. The average American home in the late 19th century measured roughly 1,000 square feet. George Washington Vanderbilt II did not build a home that was 10 times larger than average, or even 50 times larger. He built a residence 178 times the size of the dwellings inhabited by the people who built it. Inside, the volume of the space is designed to suppress the ego. There are 250 rooms in total. This includes 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, and 65 fireplaces. If a guest were to spend one night in every bedroom, it would take them over a month to sleep in the entire house. The banquet hall, the emotional center of the estate, features a ceiling that rises 70 feet into the air, 7 stories of vertical emptiness, designed solely to make a dinner party feel like a coronation. The visual impact is static, peaceful, and permanent, but the silence of the stone is deceptive. This level of perfection is not a natural state. It is a suspended state of financial tension. Every slate tile on the roof, every cubic foot of Indiana limestone, represents a transfer of wealth so significant that it altered the local economy for a decade. The beauty you see is merely the surface of a deep, consuming ocean of capital. The question that hangs in the air of the 70-foot banquet hall is not how beautiful it is, but rather, what kind of leverage was required to put it here? To understand the leverage, we must look at the year 1888. George Vanderbilt was a young man, 26 years old, in possession of an inheritance that, by conservative estimates, hovered around $10 million. Adjusted for the complex inflation of labor and materials, his purchasing power today would exceed $300 million. Unlike his industrialist grandfather, the Commodore, George was not interested in making money. He was interested in spending it on an idea. That idea required land, not a plot, but a territory. Between 1888 and 1889, his agents quietly executed a land acquisition strategy that swallowed 50 separate farms and homesteads. The final tally was 125,000 acres, an area 3 times the size of the District of Columbia. To walk the perimeter of his property would have taken days. But owning the land was the cheap part. The true cost lay in the transformation. The construction of Biltmore, which ran from 1889 to 1895, was less of a building project and more of a military occupation. The site was so remote, and the logistical demands so severe, that Vanderbilt had to finance the construction of a private 3-mile railroad spur just to bring materials to the site. The cost of this spur alone was roughly $80,000 in 1890 currency. In today's terms, that is a $2.5 million transportation expense, incurred before the foundation was even poured. Once the rail line was active, the materials began to arrive in quantities that defy casual comprehension. The house is constructed of Indiana limestone, thousands of tons of it, quarried nearly 500 miles away and shipped by rail. To bind the stone, a brick factory was built on site, capable of producing 32,000 bricks a day after day, for 6 years. The walls of Biltmore are not just stone. They are a sandwich of brick and steel, clad in limestone, designed to last for centuries. The human cost of this ambition was equally staggering. The workforce fluctuated, but at peak activity, 1,000 men were laboring on the grounds simultaneously. They were stonemasons from Europe, labourers from the local mountains, and artisans from New York. Vanderbilt had to build a village, modern-day Biltmore Village, just to house the supervisors and facilitate the logistics. By the time the house opened on Christmas Eve in 1895, the total capital expenditure was estimated to be around $6 million. If you adjust that figure using the Consumer Price Index, it seems modest, perhaps $200 million today. But that calculation is misleading. To replicate the hand-carved limestone, the intricate woodwork, and the sheer volume of masonry using modern skilled labor would likely push the replacement cost to over $2 billion. George Vanderbilt had achieved his vision. He had successfully transmuted a liquid fortune into a solid mountain of stone. But in doing so, he had created a paradox that would haunt his descendants for a century. He had built a machine that required a Gilded Age fortune to fuel right at the moment when the Gilded Age was ending. The construction was finished, but the consumption had only just begun. The house was now alive, and like any living thing of this size, it was hungry. Beneath the velvet silence of the upper floors, Biltmore was a roaring, industrial machine. While the guests in the library sat reading by the light of electric lamps, deep in the sub-basement, a technological engine was burning resources at a rate that rivaled a small factory. The house was designed to look old, but it functioned like a piece of science fiction. The heart of this system was the heating plant. In 1895, keeping a structure of 4 million cubic feet warm was a thermodynamic nightmare. The solution lay in two massive coal-fired boilers, each 16 feet long. These were not household furnaces. They were locomotive-grade engines that required a constant diet of anthracite. During a harsh winter week, records suggest the estate could consume upwards of 50 tons of coal. That is 100,000 pounds of fuel, shoveled by hand, just to keep the temperature in the banquet hall from dropping below freezing. The water system was equally ambitious. The estate required a private reservoir holding 5 million gallons of water to maintain pressure across the property. Inside the house, that pressure fed 43 bathrooms and an indoor swimming pool that held 70,000 gallons of heated water. This pool was an engineering marvel, featuring underwater lighting and a dedicated heating exchange system, decades before such amenities would become standard in even the most luxurious hotels. To fill it, heat it, and drain it was a process that consumed enough energy to power a typical Asheville home for a month. Then there was the electricity. Biltmore was fully electrified at a time when the White House was still relying partially on gas lighting. The house was wired for both alternating and direct current, a complex hybrid system designed with input from Thomas Edison's associates. The electric bill did not exist in the modern sense because the power was generated on-site or through local agreements, but the maintenance of the hundreds of light bulbs, carbon filament bulbs that burned out far faster than modern ones, required a dedicated electrician on staff. The kitchen, located in the basement to prevent odors from drifting upstairs, was a factory of caloric production. It featured a main rotisserie driven by a chain mechanism capable of roasting a whole side of beef. But the true luxury was the refrigeration. Using an ammonia-based cooling system, the walk-in pantries could store thousands of pounds of perishable food, oysters from the coast, prime cuts of meat, and out-of-season fruits transporting by rail. This ability to arrest decay, to keep food fresh in July, was a display of wealth as potent as the tapestries. Operating this machine required a human regiment. The indoor staff roster fluctuated between 30 and 40 full-time employees. This was not a casual arrangement. It was a rigid hierarchy. At the top stood the house steward and the head housekeeper, commanding salaries that placed them firmly in the middle class. Below them was an army of footmen, chambermaids, laundry maids, and kitchen boys. The laundry complex alone occupied a space larger than most modern apartments. It employed electric drying racks and mangle irons to process the linens for 35 bedrooms and the tablecloths for the banquet hall. A single dinner party could generate hundreds of pieces of laundry. The wash cycles never stopped. The boilers never cooled. The lights rarely dimmed. The house was a living organism that required 24-hour monitoring, and the cost of that monitoring was the first crack in the foundation of the Vanderbilt fortune. To understand why Biltmore eventually became unsustainable, one must look at the math of the Gilded Age. When George Washington Vanderbilt II opened the house, his wealth was derived almost entirely from the interest generated by his inheritance. In the 1890s, a $10 million fortune invested in railroad bonds and government securities might yield a reliable 5% return. That is $500,000 of annual disposable income. In today's purchasing power, that is roughly $15 to $20 million of cash flow every year. That sounds like infinite money, but Biltmore was designed to consume it all. The operating costs of the estate were astronomical. The sheer scale of the land management, 125,000 acres, meant that the forestry department alone had a payroll of dozens of men. Gifford Pinchot, the estate's forester, was running a scientific experiment in sustainable forestry, but experiments are expensive. The estate also operated a dairy, a poultry farm, and a market garden. While these ventures produced revenue, they rarely produced a significant profit. They were subsidized industries, designed to support the lifestyle of the house rather than the other way around. By 1900, the financial pressure was becoming visible in the ledgers. The annual cost to run the household, staff wages, coal, food, electricity, and maintenance was estimated to be upwards of $250,000. That is half of his estimated annual income. George Vanderbilt was spending 50% of his cash flow just to keep the lights on and the grass cut. This burn rate did not account for his other habits. Vanderbilt was a voracious collector. He spent tens of thousands of dollars on rare books, prints, and tapestries. He traveled to Europe frequently, bringing back crates of art that required shipping, insurance, and restoration. Every new acquisition added to the inventory, but nothing added to the income. The math was simple but brutal. The estate was a liability, not an asset. It generated zero passive income. It did not produce steel. It did not ship oil. It only consumed. As long as the principle of his inheritance remained untouched, the system could survive. But the margin for error was shrinking. In 1902, the financial strain forced a subtle shift. The estate began to look for ways to monetize. The dairy operations were expanded to sell butter and milk to the local Asheville community, and eventually to Washington, D.C. The woodworking guild was established to sell furniture. These were not the hobbies of a bored aristocrat. They were the early attempts to create a revenue stream for a property that was hemorrhaging cash. But the most dangerous number was one that Vanderbilt could not control: inflation. Between 1895 and 1910, the cost of labor and materials in the United States began to creep upward. The wages for a skilled gardener or a cook were rising. The cost of coal was fluctuating. The purchasing power of his fixed inheritance was slowly eroding, while the cost of maintaining the limestone behemoth was steadily climbing. By 1910, the estate was consuming the majority of George Vanderbilt's liquid income. He was land-rich, with 125,000 acres of timber, but he was becoming cash-constrained. The perfect surface remained. The lawns were manicured. The footmen were uniformed. But behind the scenes, the financial engine was redlining. The system was built for a world where labor was cheap and taxes were non-existent. But the 20th century was approaching fast, and it was bringing a tax code that would shatter the math of the American aristocracy forever. The year 1913 marked the end of the fantasy. For 2 decades, the Biltmore Estate had operated as a sovereign island. immune to the economic realities that govern the rest of the country. But on February 3, 1913, the United States ratified the 16th Amendment, establishing a federal income tax. At first, the numbers seemed negligible. A 1% tax on incomes above $3,000, a 7% surtax on fortunes exceeding $500,000. To a man like Vanderbilt, who was accustomed to spending millions, a 7% levy might have felt like a rounding error. But it was not the amount that mattered, it was the precedent. The government had unlocked the door to private wealth, and they would never close it again. The era of tax-free accumulation was over. 17 months later, a far more immediate crisis struck. On March 6, 1914, George Washington Vanderbilt II died of heart failure following an emergency appendectomy. He was 51 years old. His death was a catastrophic financial event. The estate was not designed to function without him. It was designed around him. His vision was the only thing justifying the colossal burn rate of the property. Suddenly, the engine lost its conductor. Vanderbilt left behind his wife, Edith, and their 13-year-old daughter, Cornelia. He also left behind a property that was, by all traditional accounting standards, a financial black hole. The timing could not have been worse. The estate was asset-heavy but cash-poor. While the Vanderbilts were still incredibly wealthy on paper, the liquidity required to maintain a staff of hundreds and a house of 250 rooms was evaporating. Then, the government struck again. In 1916, the federal estate tax was introduced. The transfer of wealth from husband to widow and eventually to child was now subject to a friction that stripped capital away at every turn. Edith Vanderbilt found herself the CEO of a failing corporation. She sat in the master's office, surrounded by filing cabinets that documented the bleeding. The dairy was struggling to break even. The agricultural plots were subject to the whims of weather and market prices. The forestry operation, while scientifically pioneering, was not generating enough profit to cover the property taxes on 125,000 acres. The estate was too big to fail, yet too expensive to keep. The solution to the crisis was a massive, painful amputation. Edith realized that to save the house, she had to sacrifice the kingdom. In 1914, she began negotiations with the federal government to sell the vast majority of the estate's land. The process took 2 years of agonizing appraisal and bureaucracy. Finally, in 1916, the deal was closed. Edith Vanderbilt sold 86,700 acres of the Pisgah Forest to the United States Forest Service. This single transaction reduced the size of the Biltmore Estate by nearly 70% overnight. The sale price was approximately $5 per acre. The total check was roughly $433,000. In today's currency, that is about $12 million. While $12 million sounds substantial, consider the context. George had spent $6 million, over $150 million adjusted, just to build the house and landscape the core grounds. They were selling pristine wilderness, the ecological heart of the estate, for pennies on the dollar compared to the initial investment. It was not a sale for profit, it was a liquidation for survival. The 86,000 acres became the nucleus of the Pisgah National Forest, a public treasure born from a private necessity. The Biltmore Estate shrank from a principality of 125,000 acres to a much smaller holding of roughly 8,000 acres. The map on the wall of the office had to be redrawn. The horizon that George had purchased was no longer theirs. But nature was not done with the balance sheet. In July of 1916, just months after the land sale, a biblical flood struck Asheville. The French Broad River rose to historic levels, cresting at 21 feet. It tore through the estate's lower grounds, destroying the nursery, wiping out bridges, and devastating the agricultural sectors that Edith was relying on for revenue. The cost of the cleanup was staggering. Thousands of dollars in earnings were washed away in 48 hours. The estate, already reeling from the death of its patriarch and the sale of its land, was now physically battered. Edith Vanderbilt was forced to consolidate further. The staff was reduced. The lavish entertaining of the 1890s vanished. The house, once filled with the laughter of hundreds of guests, grew quiet. During the 1920s, the house entered a period of dormancy. The 43 bathrooms were still there, but fewer were heated. The 65 fireplaces were cold. A skeleton crew of servants, perhaps fewer than 15, struggled to keep the dust off 178,000 square feet of furniture. It was a holding pattern. The capital reserves were draining, month by month, year by year. The Great Depression was approaching, and the Vanderbilt fortune, once thought inexhaustible, was about to face its final test. The question was no longer about how to live in the house, but simply how to keep the roof from caving in. In October of 1929, the stock market crashed, evaporating 40% of the paper wealth in the United States in a matter of weeks. For the Cecils, Cornelia Vanderbilt and her husband John, the collapse was not just a headline, it was an existential threat. The estate was already bleeding. Now, the economy that supported their investment portfolio was dead. The choice was binary. Sell the house to a developer who would likely demolish it for scraps, or find a way to make the stone earn its keep. They chose the latter. On March 15, 1930, in the depths of the Great Depression, Biltmore Estate opened its doors to the public. The admission price was set at $2. In modern currency, that is roughly $35 per ticket. It was a steep price for a population standing in breadlines, yet they came. In the first year, thousands of people paid to see how the other half lived, unaware that the family living there was using the ticket money just to pay the coal bill. The $2 entrance fee was not profit. It was a desperate infusion of liquidity to keep the county tax collector at bay. For the next 2 decades, the house existed in a twilight state. The family still lived there, retreating to smaller apartments on the upper floors while strangers walked through the library downstairs. But the math of the mid-20th century was relentless. By 1956, the estate ceased to be a residence entirely. It was incorporated as a business. The Biltmore Company was born. This was the pivotal moment where the estate stopped being a home and started being a product. William Cecil, George's grandson, took over operations in the 1960s with a singular, brutal philosophy. The estate must make a profit, or it will die. He refused to turn Biltmore into a non-profit charity dependent on government grants. He believed that if the house could not pay for itself, it did not deserve to exist. He planted vineyards, not for romance, but because wine has a high profit margin. He opened restaurants and hotels on the grounds. The logic was simple. A ticket buys you a view, but a hotel room buys the estate a future. Today, that commercial engine is massive. The estate receives 1.4 million visitors annually. That is an average of nearly 4,000 people every single day, tramping through the hallways, breathing the air, touching the railings. The logistical load of this traffic is heavier than anything George Vanderbilt ever imagined. The floors require constant refinishing. The carpets are replaced in endless cycles. The estate now employs over 2,400 people during peak season, twice the number of men it took to build the house in 1895. So, what does it truly cost to keep a 250-room limestone shatter alive in the 21st century? The numbers are guarded closely by the private holding company, but tax assessments and industry estimates paint a terrifying picture. The annual operating budget of the Biltmore Company is estimated to exceed $100 million. $100 million every year. This money does not go into a vault. It vanishes into the structure. A recent restoration of the banquet hall tapestries took years of microscopic needlework, and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The repair of the conservatory roof required a specialized team of glaziers to replace glass panes that are no longer manufactured by standard machines. The heating and cooling bill alone for the main house, which must be climate-controlled 24 hours a day to preserve the priceless art, runs into the millions annually. The estate is a tax-paying entity. It contributes tens of millions of dollars in local, state, and federal taxes. It receives no public subsidy. If the visitors stop coming, the lights go out. The paradox of Biltmore is that it is more fragile now than it was in 1895. George Vanderbilt could write a check to cover a deficit. The modern estate cannot. It must earn its survival every morning when the gates open. The final calculation is sobering. In 1895, $6 million built a dream. Today, that same $6 million would barely cover the preservation budget for a single wet winter. The house stands today not as a monument to infinite wealth, but as a testament to the infinite cost of memory. It is a beautiful limestone parasite, demanding a river of gold just to remain stationary. George Vanderbilt bought a mountain to escape the world. But in the end, the world is the only thing keeping his mountain alive.